Hi there, I'm Kim Vanel. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, the end of austerity, the ideology of collective punishment, decimating the weakest in society for the economic mismanagement and crimes of the rich and powerful that may be consigned to history. And while the International Monetary Fund warns of a rise in inequality due to the pandemic, one leading charity says the lender of last resort is still dishing out loans that require countries to hack back at public services. Commerce before politics. Despite US and European opposition, Germany pushes ahead with a gas pipeline that cements its dependence on Russia, but also increases Germany's dominance over the rest of Europe. When a country's finances are in a mess and the lender of last resort needs to step in, a bailout comes with conditions, mostly draconian austerity measures. But governments have also been known to implement them for ideological reasons. The International Monetary Fund has recognised that maybe austerity is not the best course of action, and it can, in fact, make matters worse. With the pandemic, the IMF now says governments should spend and not worry about the finances until a recovery is embedded. Some would say the death of austerity should not be mourned. Why? Well, let's take a look at a few case studies from recent history. Under the IMF, European Central Bank and European Union bailout, Greece had to take an axe to public spending. The people of Greece paid a heavy price, seeing an increase in child mortality as healthcare spending was slashed from almost 10% in 2008 to 8% in 2017. The Troika had wanted spending to fall to 6%. The unemployment rate remains shockingly high at 17% last year, and the country has yet to pay off its debts. 21 IMF-administered bailouts have done little to spark Argentina's economy into life. For the past 3 years, the economy has been in recession, and the pandemic will take another huge bite out of the country. Economy Minister Martin Guzman has blamed the IMF austerity measures for the credit crisis. But Argentina has managed to convince creditors to restructure $65 billion of debt and is now in talks with the IMF about its $44 billion loan. And after a £141 billion bailout of the banks in 2008, 2 years later, Britain's then Finance Minister, George Osborne, introduced austerity measures to reduce the budget deficit. The result was debt almost doubled to $1.8 trillion. Growth was anemic, and the economy was $130 billion smaller a decade later. More than 4 million children, that's 1 in 4, lived in poverty, and more than 1 million people were forced to use food banks. Now, there is a caveat. The end of austerity is mainly for advanced economies who are in control of their own currencies and can raise money. And the IMF believes such countries should be able to stabilise their finances by the middle of the decade. Well, joining me now via Skype from London is Philip Blond, a political thinker, Anglican theologian and director of think tank Res Publica. Thank you for your time. Great to talk to you. This is interesting advice, isn't it, from the IMF, the advice to spend to save lives and to keep the economy going. But that is a huge change in contrast from the financial crisis in 2008, isn't it?
Yeah. It reminds me of John Ruskin's quote, who's a very famous English critic and writer of the 19th century. And he said, "There is no wealth but life." And I think that's true. The fundamental aim of the economy, if you will, is to allow life to flourish. But if there is no life, there is no wealth. And one of the lessons of coronavirus is that this choice between saving the economy or saving lives is palpably false. The countries that have best protected their economies are those that have best protected human life. So one only needs to contrast Asia, the performance, not just of authoritarian countries like China, but Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. Contrast their ability to control COVID with their economies. Some have even grown. Taiwan has grown by 1%, for goodness sake. What I'm slightly puzzled about from the IMF is are we to understand that third world or developing nations, rather, should pursue austerity as a response to coronavirus? That seems to make no sense at all. It seems a first-order mistake. And really what I think they should be doing, and I suspect they are, is essentially creating funds to allow those economies to spend as well, because it's only by investing in public health infrastructure, creating the conditions for people to stay in lockdown, which is the only effective approach we yet have to preventing viral spread, that we can save life and indeed save the economy.
Well, there's something we're going to talk to the interim director of Oxfam International about a little later in the programme. But I want to come back to this advice for advanced economies, at least, to spend, spend, spend. Does this just mean that we're going to see an increase in debt, in deficits, which just 12 months ago would have been unthinkable?
Well, there are different ways. You can increase debt more if you allow your economy to collapse all along the supply chain. So you can just keep contracting. It's what economist Fisher called the Fisher debt trap, that things can get so bad that your debt keeps increasing if you're not able to control it. And I think that spending well is a good instruction to essentially keep things afloat, because essentially these economies are in a state of relative health, and it's about bringing back, not destroying enough jobs and experiences and positions and supply chains, because essentially most advanced economies have safety nets. So unless they support people in jobs through expenditure, they'll have to support people out of jobs through the welfare system. And we know from all the mountains of evidence that people find it very, very hard, the longer they're in the welfare system, to bounce back into the labour market. Best to keep everything on life support so that there's enough business confidence to bounce back as quickly as you can. And I think that's really imperative. But if you essentially allow your population and the level of unemployment to rise, that essentially diminishes the possibility for recovery further down the road. So in this sense, I think that you're actually spending money to prevent greater debt later.
Let's talk about the UK for a minute. George Osborne introduced austerity for what critics believed was purely ideological reasons, to sort of shrink the state and cut public services. Now, a decade on, the number of people using food banks has risen to 1.2 million, according to the Trussell Trust. I mean, so what does that say? Is it just the vulnerable then who suffer?
What's interesting in the developed world, and this is a reference really to the ongoing popularity of Donald Trump, shall we say, is the liberalism that has governed the Western world for the past sort of 40 years essentially penalizes the working class in the developed world and helps the working class in the developing world. So if you do a distributional graph of who's benefited most from the last 40 years, it's those in the working class in the developing world, in Asia, and so on and so forth. And actually, the working classes in the Western world haven't really benefited from global growth at all. Indeed, relatively, many of their incomes are stagnant or falling. So what this then means is we introduced austerity into a system where these people are highly vulnerable anyway, where economic insecurity is the dominant theme of their lives. And you go to America and that's pervasive, this sense of that people are not stable, the poorer they are. And what that creates is the conditions for populism. And I think that what George Osborne did, you might argue in the short term, he was very effective because it priced British debt very low, so that we didn't pay anything like, for instance, Italy paid on its debt, or so on and so forth. But it went on too long, and it was ideological, and it's the only economic idea that Osborne had, and it devastated the local state. So our councils and our public services are essentially become defensive, and they didn't have the investment in them to enable them to adapt, which I think has been shown by the coronavirus crisis. Our state has become too attenuated.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time there, Philip Blond. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, while the IMF says countries do not need to introduce austerity measures or any kind of belt tightening, according to Oxfam, the majority of the loans extended by the lender during the pandemic will require some cuts to public spending. And that could force some countries to cut public healthcare, pensions and jobs, such as doctors and teachers. Well, from Madrid, Chimavera joins me now via Skype. Chima is the Interim Executive Director for Oxfam International. We really appreciate your time. This seems unfair, right? If you're an advanced economy and you're already doing okay, you can spend. The IMF says it will be fine. But if you're already struggling, belt tightening will come and things could get worse.
It will not work. It will not work for the poor people. I mean, our research has found that 84% of the 91 IMF COVID-19 loans encourage, and in some cases even require, countries to adopt tough austerity measures in aftermath of the health crisis. This affects at least 67 low and middle income countries from Nigeria to Ecuador. These austerity measures could include cuts to public services, include wage freezes, cuts to public sector workers like doctors and nurses. It includes increases in value-added taxes, which apply to everyday products in food, household supplies, and fall disproportionately on women and the poorest parts of the populations. Think in human terms. I mean, just when people think they can breathe after the pandemic, they could be losing their access to health care for themselves or their children, or losing income support having already lost their jobs. So it doesn't work for the poor people, for the most vulnerable people, and for the poorest countries.
And the IMF itself has been warning of rising inequality, has been warning of rising poverty, but many countries are dependent on international investors for money, right? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, I think it's two sides of the coin. On the one side, it seems like if the IMF has two phases, the research and sometimes the executive director are saying the right things to countries in terms of what they should be doing today. I mean, the IMF is saying spend. It has been calling for an inclusive recovery, sounded alarm bells on inequality peaking and saying that the pandemic will worsen it. I mean, the IMF has put strong research about the dangers of austerity. We are fine with that. We commend this sort of research and analysis. But then it comes the IMF actual practices. And as you say, I mean, countries need money, and they need even more money now because of the pandemics and the consequences. And so when it comes to the country by country practices, we are seeing that loans, I mean, are so far away from their words. And the IMF is very influential if they want to condition or requests into those loans. And they would be happen as soon as we begin to see the end of the pandemic. It will exacerbate the inequality across the world, and the poorest will pay that price. We have to see different ways. I mean, we have to honor this research and the consequences and the conclusions that it has. And we definitely, countries need money now. Where should it come? It should come from debt cancellation during the pandemic times. There are still too many countries that are paying more into debt service than what, for example, we are spending in their healthcare. It has to come from aid, replenishment of aid, commitments to the 0.7% of the GDP. That is 50 years now of it, and it's not there except for a few countries. And the IMF could do more. I mean, they could go further and unblock this way they have of issuing a special drawing rights, a form of global currency that can be pumped into the global economy in times of need. It is a time of need now. And they could issue even 3 trillion of these special drawing rights, which all IMF member countries would be able to access without having to repay. So there are ways of doing it that are not loans with conditions.
Okay, so that is what you think the IMF could do. What about the international community? What about the private sector? What should it be doing?
We are seeing in the debt side, I mean, if we speak about, generally speaking about the international community, they should be agreeing and going further in debt cancellation schemes. They have done something, but it's not close to what should be done, because they should include also debt from the World Bank and from other multilateral creditors, and they should include also private sector debt. I mean, it's really outrageous that now, precisely in COVID times, I mean, private lenders have not been brought into any kind of these G20 deals for debt cancellation, as most of the governments have done. So poor countries are continuing to repay debts to rich banks and to hedge funds, even now in COVID times. So you have this situation where some of the world's richest and biggest creditors and fortunes and their shareholders are cashing in checks, while people in debt distressed countries are lacking the basic public services as healthcare right now. A serious deal should mean canceling all debt payments to all rich countries, to multilateral institutions, but also for private creditors alike.
Okay, we've got time for one more. I just want to bring this back to the reality of what this all means for people who are already struggling for lives and for livelihoods, right? Because people are going to be impacted by this.
I mean, our research also shows how you can find even 64 countries including Kenya or Pakistan or Zambia, where they were already spending more on debt repayments than in healthcare, because before the pandemic hit them. Or part of our research too finds how far it's only 22% of the global workforce who has any kind of social protection, such as sick leave or unemployment protection. If it doesn't change the full economic system, and the right time is now in the tax side, in the wages side, what we will be seeing is that this big impact, we are thinking that even 500 million people could go into poverty because of the pandemic and its consequences. It will even be worse. So it needs a full shift if we are thinking about the most vulnerable, those that are most impacted by the pandemic as such, but those that are not only losing lives, but their livelihoods too.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. That is Chimavera there, the Interim Executive Director for Oxfam International. We appreciate it.
Thanks to you. A pleasure.
Now, can you de-link commercial deals from politics? Well, that's what Germany is hoping to do with the controversial Nord Stream pipeline that will bring in gas from Russia to Europe's biggest economy. That's despite the latest sanctions from the United States that take aim at Russian pipe-laying vessel Academic Chersky, which is attempting to complete the last 147 kilometres of construction. Berlin has already said it won't bow to US pressure not to go ahead with the project, despite making it more dependent on Russia for the supply of energy, which Washington believes is a security threat. Even the poisoning of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, which many thought may be a reason for Berlin to give up on the project, has been brushed aside. Some of Germany's own neighbours have imposed their own sanctions. Poland fined Russia's state-controlled gas giant Gazprom €6.5 billion for going ahead with the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline without securing its approval. Well, joining me now via Skype from Berlin is Jörg Vorburg. Jörg is a senior fellow and director for Central and Eastern Europe at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Really good to talk to you. So the US keeps imposing sanctions. Poland has issued its own penalties. I mean, is there anything that would make Berlin change its mind when it comes to Russia being such a great energy partner?
I think we have to step back a little bit on this question, because if you see the situation from Germany, from the perspective of the German government and also German business, then Russia and previously the Soviet Union have always been very reliable energy partners, going back almost half a century. So from that end, Germany is proceeding very rationally in pursuing a very strong energy partnership with Russia. What the German debate tends to fade out, however, is that Russia also uses energy as a political weapon against its neighbors, against other partners. And this is a point that is typically underestimated here in Germany. For as long as the country and its debate decouples economic and energy questions from those political and security questions relating to Russia, this decision to go for a strong partnership with Russia is not going to be reversed, unfortunately.
Well, to that end, this is what I struggle to understand, is that the pipeline will be underused. I mean, the existing pipeline has huge capacity, which is already underused. So what's this about? Is this about a geopolitical tool?
Well, this is really, in the first place, a geopolitical tool that Russia employs here. The pipeline capacity that is in place is fully sufficient to provide Europe with Russian natural gas. Supplies from Russia over the last years have been relatively flat, and there is no expectation that there would be a massive growth in volumes. So what we really have here is a diversification by Russia of its pipeline network, the creation of redundancies that would then make it possible to shift volumes from one pipeline to another, wherever Russia wants to put pressure on specific transit countries, such as Ukraine. So this is really a strategy of diversifying and expanding pipeline capacity in order to be able to use it for political pressure in the future.
There were some outside of Germany who thought that the poisoning of opposition leader Alexei Navalny may force the Chancellor Angela Merkel to change her thinking on this. What is her calculation here, do you think?
There really was a debate that started in the summer here in Germany, whether or not, in response to the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, there should be a freeze, a pause, perhaps even a cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project. There seemed to be quite some momentum. There were many senior policymakers, including from Chancellor Merkel's party, who demanded that this would be the appropriate response. And even the Chancellor at some stage herself seemed to indicate that this is not only a commercial project, as she had maintained for many years, but also one that has a strong political dimension. Now, unfortunately, this discussion has not gone any further. The momentum seems to have faded in the meantime, and there's no indication at this stage that the Chancellor and her government would take measures against this project. What I can really only do is speculate here why this is the case. In my opinion, Germany is acting irresponsibly, unilaterally in this context. It basically rhetorically always stresses that there has to be a European approach to energy policy, to energy security. But when it comes to this particular project, Germany is clearly acting unilaterally and very selfishly, in my opinion. Unfortunately, that impression has not gone away and is not being reversed by any decision by the German government anytime soon.
18 European countries have opposed this project. Italy going as far as saying this increases Germany's power in Europe. Does it?
Well, it does in a way, because it shows that a large and influential country like Germany does get away with unilateral decisions, even against an overwhelming majority of EU partners who are opposed to this project, plus a number of countries like Ukraine that find themselves outside of the EU but are very close European partners. At the same time, I think that this project is also one that would obviously put Germany into a much stronger position as an energy hub in Europe. It would put it in a different and advantageous competitive position in European energy markets. So there are a number of aspects that will increase German power and influence here. But at the same time, what this project undermines is cohesiveness amongst Europeans. This project has put a very stark divide between Germany and especially its Central and Eastern European partners in the European Union and beyond. And it will be very hard to mend these divides in the years to come if Germany does not change its tack on this controversial project.
Okay, thank you so much for your perspective, your analysis from Berlin, Jörg Froberg.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us by tweeting me at Kim Vanel and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that is it for this edition of Counting the Costs. I'm Kim Vanel from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.